Welcome back to Second Breakfast, and when I say that, this time I'm speaking to myself, because my mouth is mostly working again. Thank you to everyone who reached out and wished me well. I am on the mend, and I'm very happy to be back with you today.
I wish you all knew that agony Cam was in, not the pain of the mouth, because that was bad, but I mean that we had like a whole week, it's been like a week and a half of we're off work, at home. We could have been recording so many episodes, and I know you wanted to get so ahead and we just couldn't, and it was pretty devastating, but we're back and it's great, and we're here to finally talk about Game of Thrones once again. I'm really excited. I also hope you all had a nice holiday. I mean, holidays are still happening, so I hope that's still going well. Apologies that this episode is going out a few hours late, but whatever. It's holidays. No one knows what day it is anyway. So
it's the best we could do.
It's all fine. It's all fine.
I was very excited for this chapter.
Me
We're
too.
talking about Ned 1, or I guess
Eddard.
Eddard 1, although we're not going to say the word Eddard again
Ever
for the rest
again.
of the episode.
I'm going to say it one more time.
I was so excited for this chapter.
Me too.
I
I
feel
remember
like-
this chapter being really good, and it was.
Like the Danny one last time, this is one I remember every scene of,
Yeah.
because the show translated it so perfectly.
It really does. I know. I mean, I feel like at the end of this book, we kind of have to like do a appreciation moment for season 1 of Game of Thrones, because it's such a good adaptation. Like, obviously it's a good show, but the adaptation element is really good. It's fun to be reminded of that. Before I get into anything, I just want to say at the top, we've been spoiling things all throughout our discussions because we've seen the whole show, but I'm really, really going to spoil a big thing in this chapter discussion. So if you, for some reason, haven't finished the show, like, this is stuff that goes beyond the books, I'm going to like really spoil it for you. So just a fair warning. That's out of the way. I'm going to do a recap of the chapter and then we can get started. Sorry, I had to do a dramatic turn page turn. I had
Little
turn my page.
ASMR there.
There you go. Okay, so this is Eddard number 1 from A Game of Thrones. So King Robert Baratheon has arrived at Winterfell, and with him he brings his wife Cersei Lannister, her brothers Jaime and Tyrion Lannister, her children, and their and their like the children aren't even named. It's hilarious. And their court of like 300 people. It's like free riders, and I don't even know all the court
The
names.
Hound.
Yeah, it's people who work for them and came with them. Okay, so they brought 300 people to Winterfell. After arriving and doing the very quick formal introductions and welcomes, Robert immediately asks Ned if he can go down with him to the crypt so he can pay respects to someone. So Ned and Robert, like we've had with these last few chapters, it's been a lot of as these interactions are happening, we're getting a lot of mental backstory through the thought process of the POV character in question. So we learn that Ned and Robert are old friends. And we know this a bit already. They took down King Aerys Targaryen II together. They fought Balon Greyjoy's rebellion. They grew up together. And so as they're going through the crypt is where all of the dead Starks are buried. And it turns out Robert is wanting to pay respects to Lyanna Stark, who was Ned's sister, who died when she was 16. She was presumably killed or at least hurt by Rhaegar Targaryen, who was Aerys' son. So he was the prince. The narration is not explicit here, but that is the heavy implication. Also, Lyanna was betrothed to Robert, and he was deeply in love with her, and he was very, very devastated.
Still
when
seems
she
to
died.
be.
Yeah, he still obviously loves her and doesn't give a shit about Cersei.
He critiques the stone representation of her as being not as beautiful as she was.
Yeah, and he's like, why is she buried down here in the dark?
Yeah.
And Ned says, well, I was with her when she died. She wanted to come here. And then we get this little flashback into Ned's mind when he remembers when Lyanna died. It seemed like she was very sick. And as she was dying, she asked Ned to promise her something. The implication in the narration, it's not explicit, but the narration implies that she was asking him to promise her to bring her to Winterfell when she died, but that is not explicitly
You think
said.
So? Okay.
That's the way it's put together in the narration. I had to try to pretend I didn't know what the promise was.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later. But the narration is implying that she just wanted to be buried at Winterfell. Okay. And she wanted to be buried next to her father and her brother. So we also learn that Ned's father is also dead, as well as his brother Brandon, who was strangled by order of King Aerys when he was 20. And apparently Brandon and Ned's father had to watch him die. So that's rough. So there's a very troubled past with what's going on here. So after paying respects to Lyanna, they're still down in the crypt, and Robert's like, I gotta talk to you about something. Let's just do it now. Here's why I'm actually here. They talk about Jon Arryn's death. He died apparently very suddenly and nastily. Seems like he had a really bad sickness that fester. Quote, sickness. Telling you, it's so funny to read this knowing everything. But anyway, he was sick and he died. And then Robert is here to ask Ned to replace Jon Arryn as Hand of the King. So this is like when we first learn what the Hand of the King is. It's basically the king's right-hand man. It's like the second most powerful person in the Seven Kingdoms.
Chief of staff.
Basically chief of staff, exactly. They can command the armies, draft laws. If the king is sick or absent, they can like do things on his behalf. Right. And like Robert's like, I need you by my side. Yeah. You're not doing shit for me up here in the north. Like nothing's happening. I need your help.
And he says basically Ned's the only person he can trust.
Yes, exactly. And Ned, in his internal narration, he is the last thing he wants. He does not want to do this, right. But he kind of has to say, like, I'm so honored. Like, what a kind thing to say. Mm-hmm. Let me talk to my wife about it for a bit, and then I'll let you know. And then, and Robert's like, okay, fine, that sounds good. And then as Ned is leaving the crypt, he feels this really intense sense of dread, and he says to himself, winter is coming. And that's the end of the chapter. Man, this one was so fun to dive into. I really have just like one big thing to talk about.
All right, let's go.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay, sounds good. So, let me start from the top. The things that we know.
Can do the recap again.
The spoiler things that we know after this. Lyanna's promise is not about being buried at Winterfell. She is asking Ned to promise her that he will take care of Jon Snow, because turns out Jon Snow is actually her and Rhaegar's son and not Ned's bastard son. So Jon is a Targaryen, okay? And also, I think, isn't Lyanna technically secretly married to Rhaegar? So Jon's not even a bastard. He's like the rightful heir.
I believe so.
Okay, great. So we know that at the top. We also know that Jon Arryn did not get ill. He was poisoned. They also talk about, I didn't say in the recap, they talk about how Lyanna, Catelyn's sister /
Lysa?
Yeah, sorry, Lysa. Oh, God. These LYs, man. Lysa Arryn, who is Jon Arryn's wife / Catelyn's sister, she just kind of like took her son and fled after he died. It's because she fucking worked with Peter Baelish to poison him. But whatever, we learned that later.
The scariest part of season 1, Lysa Arryn.
Oh my God, she's terrifying. Mommy, booby.
Shout out Kate Dickie from The Witch.
Oh my gosh, yeah. She's so good. But so what I was noticing throughout this chapter was really on a like language level, like a word choice level. I noticed a lot of uses of words like eyes, watching, and also blind. So I was like, okay, interesting.
Seen and unseen makes a grand return to the second Breakfast podcast.
We're so shocked, but it's so big here. So, for like, I'll throw out some examples. When they first arrive and Robert's like, I want to go down to the crypt, and Cersei's like, surely the dead can wait. Robert just literally looks at Cersei and like doesn't say anything, and like that shuts her up, and then he gets to go down. So he silences her with a look. When they are walking together, Ned says to Robert, kings are a rare sight in the north, which is interesting. But this is where it gets more explicit. When they're in the crypt, multiple times, we see things about how the dead are watching them with their blind eyes. So it says, the lords of Winterfell watched them pass. In long rows they sat, blind eyes staring out into the eternal darkness. Blind stone eyes seemed to follow them as they passed. Mm-hmm. The echoes rang through the darkness, and all around them, the dead of Winterfell seemed to watch with cold and disapproving eyes.
Echoes?
Yeah, that's true. Ned could feel the eyes of the dead. They were all listening, he knew, and winter was coming.
There was another line about the faces watch. I think it's Robert's laughing about like one of the women he's cheating on Cersei with, and there's a line about the statues watching disapprovingly.
Yes,
so
exactly.
They're even given features and qualities. It's not just that they're watching; it's that they're listening and almost commenting.
Right, and I was really intrigued by the oxymoron of their eyes being blind, but they're clearly watching and judging and making determinations. And so then I thought back to the first Bran chapter, when we see the dire wolf dead in the snow with the pups. And there are a couple lines in there too. One of them is that when Bran is looking at the dead dire wolf, it says, Bran glimpsed blind eyes crawling with maggots, a wide mouth full of yellow teeth. When we read that chapter, I connected the dire wolf itself to Ned. I connected it to the Stark house as a whole, but very especially to Ned, saying that, like, I think I said Ned is blind to a lot of the realities of the like betrayal and or treacherous nature of the people around him. Like, he's pretty blind to that. And then he like blabs his big fat mouth when he learns about the, you know, Jaime and Cersei's secret and all that.
To Littlefinger.
Yeah,
right?
right. So there's that. But so I'm thinking, okay, blind eyes. What also really stuck out to me from that Bran chapter was when Bran is looking at Ghost, the white albino wolf pup that Jon gets. It says, Bran thought it curious that this pup alone would have opened his eyes while the others were still blind. And we talked a lot about that, about how Jon is sort of separate from the rest of the Starks. He is more aware of the grim realities of the world because of his bastard status. He leaves and goes to the wall and sees a lot of shit a lot more quickly than a lot of other people do. He is the first to know about the White Walkers and all that. So I was thinking about that. So I'm thinking, okay, the Starks are blind, right? Like, if we, let's extend this metaphor. The Starks as a house, as a family, are blind to the realities of the world. They're not stupid. They're not naive. And I don't mean that, but they're
isolated.
They're isolated. Exactly. And that's talked about a lot in this chapter too. Like, Robert's like, the North is bigger than all the other 7 kingdoms combined. It's like Texas, right? And he's like, it took me fucking forever to get here. There's nothing out here. Where are your people? They're all hiding. Like, you're just out here and there's nothing. And so if the Starks are sort of like blind and secluded in the North, and even like like blind in a stubborn way, like stuck in their ways. I mean, even their gods are blind, right? Their gods are nameless, faceless. They have to carve faces on trees to give their gods any sense of vision, right? Or personality. And then of course their dead are blind. That's said 1,000 times in this chapter. In the crypt, all of these dead Starks are blind, and yet they can see perhaps only a death after they've sort of been like exposed to the realities. Like, they know better now that they've died, right? Lyanna knows better, Brandon knows better. Like, after having died, their eyes are a bit more open.
They're in touch with those unseen gods now.
Right.
They've gone to that like immaterial plane and presumably have some sort of access or knowledge or wisdom that Ned can only kind of scratch at the surface of sitting in the God's Wood.
Right, exactly. But of course, the exception here seems to be Jon Snow, who is not blind like the rest. We get that in the Bran chapter. We get that from just knowing the story. And he's not even a true Stark. I mean, he's not like a Stark like at all. I mean, he kind of is technically, with Lyanna being his mother, but like it, you know, when
he's
we first
half Stark.
Yeah,
that's something.
But when we first meet him, we think, oh, he's a bastard Stark, but really he's a true-born Targaryen. So he's like not a Stark. Okay.
Well, Targaryens are so into inbreeding that true-born might mean something different.
Well, that is true.
Yeah.
But so if Jon is this exception, like, as I was thinking about all this chapter is a Ned chapter, but it's really a Jon chapter. Okay.
Oh.
Because we also get, when we learn about the Lyanna promise, right? Like so we've been going through this chapter, like there's been all this stuff about blindness, and we're thinking about Jon and how his pup can see, and like all this stuff about the Starks. We're going through this chapter. They talk about Lyanna and her promise. And then immediately after that, Ned says to Robert, tell me about Jon. He means Jon Arryn, but he doesn't say Jon Arryn. Partly that's because they know him well, and he is like a father to them. He wouldn't say Jon Arryn. He would say, tell me about Jon. But I think that is intentionally ambiguous, because we've only heard about Jon Arryn once, 2 chapters ago. We've never even met him. We've met another Jon whose name is spelled the same, and we've met him on the page, and
Stuart.
we're a lot closer to and we're a lot closer to him.
Yeah. And
the next chapter is from Jon.
Mm-hmm.
And the chapter we just read is from Dany, who is a Targaryen, and we learn about Rhaegar and all of his stuff from the Targaryen perspective.
Well, I think I can take it a little further, because
Do it.
The way I know, I feel like such a stupid, dumb sometimes. Like I've been into this series for, I don't know, 10 years, right about. And I just realized that Ned named his oldest son after Robert. Because Rob, for 10 years,
yeah.
I've just been stuck on the idea that Rob is spelled with 2 B's. I haven't thought about Robert being the inspiration for that name. But of course, Jon Snow, Jon Arryn.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
Did Lyanna even live long enough to give him a name? Or would Ned have done that?
I bet Ned probably named him.
Honoring that sort of pseudo-father.
He probably did, yeah.
There's an even stronger connection there.
Sure. Yeah. And what's even more fun is the other like big language red flag that was waving for me in this chapter, apart from the eyes and blindness and watching, was there was a lot of fire and burning going on. Okay, so we get that Sandor Clegane had his terrible burned face.
Yep.
There's flickering light down in the crypts when Ned is sort of reminiscing about Rhaegar. It says that he had rubies that flashed like fire in the sunlight. The waters of the trident ran red with blood. And Robert describes Jon Arryn's sickness. He says the sickness was like a fire in his gut. It burned right through him. So we've got all this stuff about Jon. And we've got this like fire, like red burning language also going on, which of course makes you think of the Targaryens, especially when we just read a chapter from Dany, a Targaryen. And so what I think is happening here, my conclusion is that this is a chapter about Ned, but it's really a chapter about Jon, specifically about Jon's like prophecy. If we've been thinking about prophecy and destiny and foretelling, like through like backstory and symbolic omens, I think that this is about Jon. Like I think that, I mean, it's so hard to tell because of course I know everything, so I'm digging really deep and I've got confirmation bias. But I think that Jon's parentage is not revealed in this chapter. That is far too bold a statement, but the hints are there.
All of the strongest evidence is here.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the bridge between the first Dany and the first Jon chapter is the link between them.
Right. I really like that. And it's so cool to hear, like what I loved was reading the stuff about Rhaegar from 2 different perspectives, 2 chapters in a row, which should tell us that neither one is exactly true. I mean, and that's what's so great about a multi POV series is that you get different perspectives and you get different versions of the same truth. Mm-hmm. Because in Dany's memory, or at least what Dany's been told by Viserys, is that Rhaegar was, killed, and that his wife, who was like the Princess of Dorne, that her like baby was ripped from her breast and she was brutally murdered, and it was terrible, and their family was betrayed and they were driven out of Westeros, and it was awful. And then of course Robert's memory of Rhaegar is that he doesn't say what he did to Lyanna. We know later, I think, that he thinks that he attacked and raped Lyanna, but he thinks like Rhaegar did this terrible thing to Lyanna, and it's his fault she's dead, and he was this terrible prince and this terrible king, and like we did all this stuff and we brought justice to the 7 kingdoms. So they've got these 2 different ideas of what happened. Neither is true. And so we've already been sort of primed to not trust anybody's memory of what's happened in the past. So I think it's all there. And I just thought it was really fun to break down.
I really like that claim that this is sort of a pseudo Jon chapter. I think you caught a lot of things that just don't speak to me in this chapter. I think this is one of those chapters where I'm very glad we're doing this together, because
okay, cool.
I think you saw this differently. Even though you mentioned some of the lines I want to talk about, I like that you got something so different out of them. I want to take a second before I get into my stuff to just appreciate we're settling into George R.R. Martin's writing style, and we have spent a long time with Tolkien and Sapkowski through the Lord of the Rings and the Witcher series, and I've really appreciated and respected the way that they write. I think Sapkowski plays with ideas better than most anyone in the fantasy genre. Yeah. And I think Tolkien, of course, has that richness of character. Everything feels like such a grand story. There's such texture to his world that it was so much fun to read and do a close reading of. But I'm starting to zero in on what I like so much about George R.R. Martin. And I had to write down the phrase that really hit me in this chapter. And it was just 2 words, because I noticed this the past couple weeks. I would start writing down an observation, and then the character would point it out.
So you're like, oh, he's got it. Yeah.
So And I think that is very much heightened in this chapter, where George is interested in doing, or having his characters do, some of that analytical work. I think that is part of the way he works through these story ideas in these fictions. But there are certain phrases that are such distilled expressions of ideas that we could spend 2 hours talking about. When he's describing the tone of Robert's voice, when he's discussing Lyanna and sort of reliving what happened to her and going through the motions of that loss again, he uses the phrase remembered grief.
I loved that phrase.
Like, instead of saying he's choked up or anything, he's doing something much more creative and interesting. But that phrase, remembered grief, because you could just say grief. You could say he was, I think it was hoarse with remembered grief.
Yeah,
his voice was hoarse with remembered grief. But throwing remembered in there is so interesting because it doesn't just mean reliving. It doesn't mean that he's just like ripping open the scab. It means something else.
Yeah.
There's such an intangible quality to remembered grief. Throwing that qualifier on there, I think that's a curveball that I just had to stop reading and look at for a while and try to make sense of.
Yeah.
And I really like that we have found a writer that we're going to be spending so much time with who has the same interests and proclivities that we do in discussing and analyzing fiction. So
yeah, I love that.
I think in trying to search for his identity as a writer, I'm finding more and more that he is a kindred spirit with us.
I love that. Yeah, because that's been interesting as we're going through these chapters, is they're so different from how we talked about Sapkowski that we're like not quite sure how to do this. Like it's been fine, but it's been like, okay, we can't have a big philosophical, big picture discussion.
Not yet, anyway.
Well, not yet,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, we're still in the setup phase. We're only like 4 chapters in, and they're all like 10 pages long. So we're one Sapkowski chapter into this book, and so like it's been not hard to find stuff to talk about, certainly not, but it's been difficult to readjust and talk about stuff in a different way.
Yes.
And I think we're starting to really find that identity.
It's a new rhythm.
Yeah.
And I think we're finding some of the big ideas. And for me, this continues week to week to pan out. And when it doesn't pan out, I'll stop talking about it. But death and prophecy are still the meatballs that are going on in this chapter. And I noticed 3 basically combinations of those ideas. I think they're getting more and more distilled and focused as we move through and get more established in this narrative. I'm going to start calling them just death prophecies.
Okay, cool.
Because they're becoming more focused in that way.
And like most characters in this series do die, so it works out
And
great.
wrestle with prophecy.
Yes,
so
right.
I have 3 sort of lightning bolt moments of death prophecy. And the first one you already brought up in a different context, and that one is kings are a rare sight in the north.
I loved that line so much, especially because I thought about king in the north, and then like we then learn like, I don't know, 2 paragraphs later about how there used to be kings in the north, and anyway, it was fun.
But kings are a rare sight in the north. It's like, okay, Ned, Robert's in the north, he's gonna die. John, Rob, like Stannis, I guess. A lot of these
Sansa,
guys,
kind of, for 2 seconds.
sure.
Yeah,
A lot of these guys who are somewhat related to the north. I include Stannis because he's close to Robert, and Robert's associated with the north. Like, a lot of these guys are not going to have great endings. But it doesn't mean any of them in particular in this moment. It's just setting up. It's giving like the haze of future death.
Well, and even, because we learn about Robert and Ned like sort of defeating Balon Greyjoy when he tried to be king of the Iron Islands.
Yes.
And I feel like the way that's written is sort of like mocking Balon Greyjoy for like thinking he could be king of the Iron Islands. Like, we shut that shit down real fast, you know? So that's like sort of like hinting that maybe trying to be king of the North is also not going to go very well.
These themes of death and prophecy are present. They're baked through the cake of this chapter. Robert arriving to Winterfell is a funeral procession.
Totally, yes.
It's all of these people in their finery, stomping in one line all the way to Winterfell.
Yeah, that's true.
And Ned's memories of Robert's ascent. I like that you mentioned that we get these sort of, in a good way, biased memories and representations of their history together through this POV character. His memories of Robert's ascent and success in claiming the throne, they feel so fated and destined in retrospect. There is this like sweeping epic tragedy ultimately in the way he seems to view Robert. Not just because he's like let himself go and he's a shitty king now, but in the arc of their lives together. I think there's a sadness that comes through in this chapter.
Yeah, right. Because like Ned can't be fully honest with him as a friend because he has to treat him as his king. I mean, you know, Robert keeps saying like, stop calling me your grace. Like, can you, like, you're my best friend. Like, can we talk like friends? But Ned's like, well, there's still stuff I have to, like, protocol I have to go by. And I can't say no to being handed the king because you're the king. So there's like a sadness of like a loss of the friendship they once had.
Also, just because they haven't seen each other in so long.
Yeah, and they can't like call each other on the phone. So what are they going to do?
The only time they've seen each other since Robert won the throne seems to be in stamping out the Greyjoy rebellion.
Yeah, which was 9 years ago.
Right.
So it's been a long time.
And the first thing that Robert does when this funeral procession arrives is go to visit the crypt.
Oh, yeah.
And the crypt I was so interested in because obviously Death and Prophecy are going to be literally on the walls there.
Mm-hmm.
The crypt was this shivering, storied, inhospitable place.
It's described so beautifully.
It's
And
gorgeous.
His descriptions
Gorgeous.
are so good.
And it's almost literally full of ghosts. Because you have these statue representations of the dead that are making it feel so cluttered and claustrophobic, but also because they all have faces.
And they're all like described as ghosts too. Like it says that the statues are given swords so that they can carry them into the afterlife or something. And like Ned at one point expresses like a fear that once the sword is rusted away is like the spirit or ghost like then not at rest. So like he like literally believes in the idea of a ghost. So like, yeah, that's all down there.
So a cold, storied, sacred place full of ghosts and faces.
Mm-hmm.
The crypt is to this chapter what the Godswood was to the Catelyn chapter.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And I love the reframing of that. Yes, there's a structural echo there, but I want to look at kind of the character positions there, because if you take that comparison, Ned is now occupying the Catelyn role. Where he's sort of, Robert is the Catelyn role.
Okay, yeah.
He's the outsider.
Yes,
because Ned is the constant between those two. Between Catelyn and Robert, Ned is, he's the Harry to their Ron and Hermione.
Yeah, sure.
He's the constant, he's the sentinel, he's the long-suffering Northman.
Yeah.
But I love the idea of this king who has such pageantry and respect, him being in that outsider position, because he's the one shivering in the cold.
Mm-hmm.
Ned doesn't flinch.
Yeah.
He's used to it. In the same way Catelyn almost, she hesitated at the precipice of walking into the Godswood.
Yeah, she doesn't like going in there.
Robert seems to have come to Winterfell, yes, to ask about the Hand of the King, but I think it was mostly to see Lyanna. And the fact that he storms in and then he sort of hesitates.
Yeah.
He's still kind of freaked out by this place. And he starts whining about it being cold.
Yeah, and he doesn't like that she's buried here. He wishes she was buried down in the south on a hill and under the sun,
It's an interesting way to qualify his character when we have been building him up for a while. But I love the Death and Prophecy of that. Kings are a rare sight in the North because it's casting this blanket fear and kind of pit in your stomach over all of these characters, and particularly the ones who aspire to any sort of royal position. The second lightning bolt of Death Prophecy in this chapter, you also mentioned, that one is the most famous meatball of this series, Promise Me Ned.
Yeah.
And this one, instead of being exactly a death prophecy, I'll rephrase it a little and call it a prophecy of the dying.
Okay.
Because of the way Lyanna is, it's basically her final words.
Yes.
They're laden with such meaning.
Yes.
And such
especially because
history.
She's dying.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
her
the
death
most meaningful
gives
they
it
could
meaning.
be.
Yeah.
Exactly. And because Ned so honors his sister, in the same way he so honors Robert, these... I keep thinking of Cora from Downton Abbey every time I say Robert.
Robert.
Because he so loves and respects these people, when they ask something of him, those words are law.
Yes.
So when Lyanna asks whatever she asked about the promise, that is like a solemn vow that he is locked into forever.
Cannot break it.
And when Robert gives him this job offer, I guess, to become Hand of the King, Ned receives it as a declaration.
Yes.
It is handed down.
Yes.
The words have this prophetic, magnetic quality because of the source. Even though he knows that position has been so recently stained by death.
Yes.
So it's an interesting connection between Lyanna's Promise Me Ned and Robert's Be the Hand of the King.
Interesting.
Where they're both prophetic and they both have this tinge of death to them.
Yes. I think what's cool is that, or interesting, is that Ned has to consult Catelyn on only one of them. He can't consult Catelyn on the Lyanna one,
right?
But he does want to consult her on the Hand of the King one. So maybe that either shows. I mean, number one, it's a difference in the prophecy, the promises there, and what can happen with them. But two, maybe it also shows growth. Like, last time I lied to my wife about this thing. It's been really tough and it's caused a lot of problems. Maybe I'll be honest with her this time. So, but also, was he even? Yeah, he must have been married to Catelyn when that happened because he had to bring back the bastard son. So. Yeah, he had probably just been married to Catelyn. Not married long, so.
The third lightning bolt death prophecy I want to talk about. It's a bit of a curveball. It's a little different. It's kind of snuck in right at the end of the chapter after Ned says yes to the Hand of the King role, and Robert extends this sort of, wouldn't it be nice if we were also related by blood, so let's betroth our children to each other?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention that. But yeah, that happens
So,
too.
yeah, it's basically like, I have Joffrey. We don't know who he is yet.
Yeah, his
I
son,
have Joffrey,
apparently.
you have Sansa. Let's make our kids get married. They don't have to do it yet because Sansa's
11.
But
Robert's like, we can wait a few years. I'm like, how many is a few?
And they can be betrothed.
Yeah.
And just surface level, there's an echo there between the betrothal of Robert and Lyanna.
Of course, yeah. Also, Ned's brother, Brandon, was supposed to marry Catelyn.
Right.
Like, I think he died like a week before they were supposed to get married, like right before they were supposed to get married.
So that's two betrothals to presumably teenagers, basically, that end in horrific death.
Yes.
So now
early horrific death. Yeah.
Now we're throwing that we're sprinkling that death prophecy on the unknown Sansa at this point.
And also, by the way, we just saw in the last chapter a young girl be betrothed to somebody for political reasons, and we know what's going to end in death.
Right.
So.
And Ned, I feel like this reminded me a little bit of a Tolkien moment, because we talked about, there's a moment sort of at the climax of Return of the King where Sam seems to speak to Tolkien. This was our analysis at the time, and I stand by it, where it felt like he was almost tapping the ceiling of the narrative and asking Tolkien for more time to accomplish his task.
Yes.
And I think Ned feels like his ears kind of stand up here. And I think there's a moment that is almost knocking against the fourth wall, where the themes are so overwhelming that for a second the characters seem to notice them. Because Ned is hit by, quote, a terrible sense of foreboding. And I think that's sort of, these themes have saturated so much into this story, the death and the prophecy, that him feeling a terrible sense of foreboding, that is the death and the prophecy. And he's in this crypt and he's freaked out and he's got all these futures being laid out before him. And I like that he has that moment of like, ugh.
Yeah,
Because, for the reader, it's exciting because we know there will be fun, freaky, awful things that are going to happen in the future.
Oh, yeah.
But also for a character who seems so unshakable. Yes, he's only 35, but the more and more that we know about his history, I think he's earned the sort of kind titles that Bran gave him in his chapter of being wise and good. The more I know Ned, the more I like Ned.
Yeah.
So for him to be a little, just for a moment, just rattled, just shivering for a second, that's a beautiful piece of character development.
Totally. Especially when in the Bran chapter, we saw him scoff at the idea of symbols when they were like, oh no, a stag antler through a dire wolf? That doesn't bode well. He was like, it's just a dead wolf. Like, calm down. He's like, it doesn't mean anything.
Diorama of my future.
He puts no stock in that.
Right.
But being down here in the crypt, and especially when he's got something, I guess, that's directly connected to him and like his future, he has a much different reaction.
The last thing I want to work through for this chapter is Macbeth.
Of course it is.
Because as much as I'm talking about kind of dialing into what George R. Martin is interested in, as a guy who's very much up on European history and freely pulling things from legends and stories, I think he's very aware of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In the same way he's aware of Tolkien. I think they're both sort of on his Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, they've got to be.
We have formulated this Winterfell arc, not counting the Dany chapter really, because most of the rest of the story has been Winterfell so far.
And the Dany chapter really just serves to tell us about Jon.
Sure.
I think, at least.
The Dany chapter too?
Yes.
Okay.
It's all about Jon. Jon is the main character. That's going to be my thesis going forward. I know there's not a main character. That's the point. But like, it's all about Jon. I'm just saying.
Sure. I think it should have been. So yes, I do think there's Macbeth throughout this Winterfell arc.
Yeah.
And the way I pitched it last time was that Robert's arrival was going to be sort of the fork in the road of, is Robert going to be King Duncan? We don't know who these Catelyn and Ned people are yet. We had that lovely listener message that said, like, they could end up being Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. They could kill Robert. We don't know.
Right.
So this is the pseudo Duncan's arrival. And that's King Duncan, who Macbeth and Lady Macbeth kill, and that's the, blood on the hands and the prophecy, and that starts the whole spin into death. And him being king and replacing Duncan, and, it's a whole fun thing.
Yeah. Spoilers for Macbeth, I guess.
And we do start this chapter in that Macbeth posture, where Robert is introduced like Duncan, where he's very trusting and cordial, and possibly too trusting of Ned.
Okay.
For a guy that we've heard about, but haven't really met yet.
Okay.
For a guy who's always watching and listening. And we don't know, he's playing his cards pretty close to the chest. He's not even being honest in private with how he feels about Robert.
Yeah.
And the way Ned is introduced is very much like Macbeth in that scene when Duncan arrives, because he's deferential and polite, but there's a grimness to him.
Yeah.
And a possible resentment. But throughout these pages, I think both of these characters shift and clarify their roles for us, and very, very much deviate from that Macbeth posture that I was seeing them in when we started. Robert is much more intimate and brotherly and confessional than Duncan ever was with Macbeth.
Yeah.
They have such... I mean, they're not equals because one of them's king, but they're equals on a generational level. They're equals in their interpersonal history. And I would say Robert becomes much more like Banquo, an old friend of Macbeth. There's some tension sometimes. Yeah. And because we have that betrothal at the end of this chapter, I think that really strengthens it, because Banquo's defining feature in the play, his defining function in the play, is to be the father of Fleance.
Yes, right.
And here we have the tease of a son and a betrothal that could cause some generational drama. And if you know Macbeth, there's some drama around Fleance.
Sure. Well, and Banquo dies, right?
Yes, that's the whole thing with Banquo's ghost.
Yes, yeah, I was gonna say it's his ghost that Macbeth sees at the dinner scene.
Yes, yes, it is.
I wonder if is it Macbeth's fault that Banquo dies? I don't remember.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I don't remember.
He sends assassins to go kill Banquo and Fleance.
And Fleance, that's right.
He's so poisoned and paranoid by this prophecy that he needs to knock out Banquo and his whole line, because the witches have said that Banquo will have kings.
That's right. Okay, I couldn't remember who was made to.
He hires assassins to kill his best friend and
his son.
Oh,
right. Okay.
So we don't know if we're going to get there, but I think the tease of the betrothal is an interesting gesture in the Fleance direction.
Sure,
if we're recalibrating these guys to be more Macbeth and Banquo than Macbeth and Duncan.
Okay, cool. Interesting.
And the way Ned is sort of evolved from this initial posture of Macbeth is that he is unflinchingly loyal and unambitious. He doesn't want power. He doesn't want the hand of the king. He wants to be the head of Winterfell.
Yeah, he wants to stay where he is.
Not a step beyond the Godswood.
Nope.
Nothing in the outside world.
No, absolutely not.
He's hopelessly, beautifully, tragically duty-bound.
Right. And even Robert says to Ned, before he even asks him, as a way, I guess, to tease it out and try to manipulate him, he's or just being honest, he's like, you should come to the South. It's so much better. It's warmer. The wine is amazing.
The fruit.
Everybody's drunk and fat, and the girls are so beautiful, and they're naked. And he's trying to tempt Ned to come down there. And that doesn't, nothing in the narration suggests that Ned even gives a single shit about that. You know?
There continues to be a total lack of a villain tease or a heel turn.
Yeah.
There's no hint that he's going to kill this Duncan or he's going to become this scheming, cloying social climber like Macbeth.
Right.
He's just Ned.
Yeah.
He is just one of the stone statues in the crypt.
Yes, exactly.
And yet, as we're recalibrating these characters, the themes and temptations that are so present and gorgeously rendered in Macbeth persist throughout this chapter. The witches are more pronounced. Compare I made this argument during the Catelyn chapter in the Godswood. Compare the presence of the monolithic stone statues in the crypt to the unseen gestures of being watched in the Godswood. They're becoming much more overt. And if the witches are these sort of agents of prophecy, an unseen metaphysical whatever, I think those are the figures in the crypt that are cramping these people and crowding them with death and prophecy and pressure and future and history. It's interesting to see the witches come into the fore, because we're never going to see them explicitly.
Yeah.
So we have to find them in the margins.
Yeah. Could we make an argument of Lyanna being a witch? I mean, in her death, she is a witch, right? Not a witch, but a prophetic witch here. Like the Promise Me Ned thing, it really binding Ned and it really controlling what he does. And of course, that feels like a prophecy about Jon. And that's what I just spent 20 minutes talking about, is what Jon will become and what his future and his prophecy is. So maybe
I think that's amazing.
You could add that in there.
And maybe that can become sort of a term or a role that we look for going forward.
I mean, even Lyanna's death is like, you can read that as like a witch or a prophecy for Robert, because that continues to affect him. Her death, he's in love with her until he dies.
Right.
And it means he doesn't love Cersei, which means like they don't have a good connection, which might partly explain why she has all of her incest bastard children. I mean, that's not the reason. She's just a fucking weirdo, but like, it doesn't help that they're not close. So
it's an interesting distinction, because we've been talking about ghosts a lot. We have plenty of dead characters who are influencing things, but it's interesting to add this like witch classification.
Yeah.
And that seems to be someone who died with an unresolved death prophecy.
Yes.
Because Lyanna would now fit that camp. Yeah, I want to keep looking for that as we move forward.
Yeah.
The next sort of theme that I think has persisted from the Macbeth framing is that the work of this story, and particularly the work of this chapter, is the parsing of prophecy.
Okay.
Wrestling with its implications and possibilities. And that is what Ned does. He is as much a POV character as he is us reading and writing and talking about this chapter.
Yeah.
He's, I mean, the way we read, so much of this chapter is in his mind, much more than anything he's saying.
Yes.
He's the least verbal POV character we've had so far.
Yeah.
He's almost acting as an interpreter here, doing the work that the writer usually does, studying the scene and analyzing it right along with us.
Totally. Well, I even wrote in my margins as I was reading, like Ned is a like very like clearly defined character, and I felt him in this chapter, but I also felt like this is the most where I felt like I'm reading a third person omniscient narrator and less like I'm reading from a character, because he felt like a narrator. Like that's what his character
because
feels
he's so
like.
watchful
Yes.
and thoughtful.
Yes.
And that act of analyzing, interpreting, studying, that is the work that drives Macbeth crazy. And that hasn't driven Ned crazy yet. But it's an interesting tease.
Yeah.
And it does clarify the way in which he's similar to Macbeth. It's not the ambition.
Yeah.
But it is that attentiveness to prophecy.
I like that, especially because then we look at the character of Macbeth in a more nuanced and robust way, instead of just
as we should.
Macbeth, the ambitious guy. Like there's more to him than that. Yeah.
None of Shakespeare's tragedies are about ambition.
Yeah.
We also get, and this was one of my favorite little echoes, we get our first flashes of combat. Because we have Robert and Ned, not really much about Ned, but Robert as this as this
You gotta do it every time.
retired military figure.
Yeah.
And we don't see him in combat. We get flashbacks of him in combat.
Yeah, we remember him in combat.
In memory, with like the fuzzy framing and the filter. And
the
it's
romanticized version.
It's been glorified over time.
Yeah.
And we get flashes of him at the Trident and stamping out the Greyjoy Rebellion.
Yeah.
And in those moments, we see he was really tall. He was clean shaven. He was in shape. He had this huge helmet and this big Warhammer battle axe.
Ned couldn't even lift it, but like Robert was like, yeah.
He's towering. I mean, he seems bigger than the mountain. Yeah. He has this wild fury and fierce power, like Macbeth does on the battlefield.
Oh, okay, yes.
Because we get that unbelievable line from the beginning of the play where we see him in combat briefly, in this little vignette-like moment where he unseams a guy.
Yes.
Which is such a memorable touch of violence, where he's dragging the sword up from his, private area up to his neck and just ripping the guy in half.
Yeah.
And I like that we get a flash of really memorable historical violence from Robert. Robert. Character-wise, I think this echo muddies the water even more.
Sure, yeah, because now you're connecting Robert to Macbeth instead of Ned.
And
Love that.
And we've just seen how Ned is like Macbeth, but not quite how we initially thought.
Right.
So both Robert and Ned have some Macbeth in them. And I think that cross-pollination, that muddies the waters between them.
Sure.
It sort of strengthens and blurs that brotherly bond that they have.
Well, and of course, Robert then like becomes king. Like he doesn't kill the king. That is Jaime's job, but he usurps and takes the throne.
Right.
And it's because of Robert that the king is killed and he gets to become king. So of course that's a Macbeth echo.
Right. So now we're breaking it down, making it more complicated. There's some Macbeth in both of these men.
Yeah.
And similarly, now that we're finally meeting and inhabiting Ned as a POV character, after 2 other chapters on his periphery via Catelyn and Bran, coming into his mind and his perspective, I chiefly know him as a father and a husband.
Yeah.
I don't know him as a brother to Robert. I don't know him as the what is he? The King in the North, sort of
the
Lord of Winterfell.
Lord of Winterfell. Yeah. Lord of Winterfell. Yeah.
I know him as a father and a husband.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that cross-pollinates him with Banquo. Because he's the family man with a future. And he might have future kings, at least kings in the North. And that makes Bran Fleance.
Well, he could also have kings if Sansa marries Joffrey and then Ned's grandchildren become king.
Because we only know in the abstract that Robert has children. We know Bran. We know the world initially through Bran's eyes.
Yeah.
So Bran, who could be fated and futured and prophesy, he could be Fleance.
Yeah, I mean, the way this is set up, it makes Bran feel very like heir, chosen one. Like opening your epic fantasy book with a young boy, like big, chosen one suggestion, right? Of course, that is flipped on its head, and it's not quite what you think it's going to be.
So there's some Macbeth and there's some Banquo in both
cool.
Ned and Robert.
That's really cool. I like that.
The last little just pinprick observation. Cersei is obviously Lady Macbeth.
Well, obviously. Yeah.
The second she's introduced, like, Catelyn who? Catelyn who?
Yeah.
No, it's got to be Cersei.
Obviously Cersei. Yeah. I can't wait to read from Cersei. Man, she's so much fun. Do we get her in this first book? I don't think we do.
As a POV? No.
Yeah.
No.
We only get her from like Tyrion and Sansa, I think. And a little bit of Ned, I suppose.
Sure.
But wow. Well, that's a really fun way to think about it. And I like doing that kind of thing, or hearing you do that kind of thing, because it could all be very intentional from George's perspective, but it also, like, just because we're making these connections doesn't mean that that's what George was like consciously doing when he was writing these characters. But looking at it like that helps us understand the story better, and it helps us understand like the story of Macbeth and the story of this story better. So it's really fun.
And I think Macbeth is such a classic in what actually happens, in the character archetypes, in the plot, in the history, that it's sort of baked into everything.
Yeah.
So even if it's not intentional, that story structure is present. It's subliminal. Like so many movies have ripped off Star Wars that you might make a movie that feels like the original Star Wars even if you've never seen it.
Right.
It's just part of that cultural memory.
Of course. Yeah. No, I really like that. Oh,
I can't help but do this Macbeth thing for as long as it works.
Well,
I never
think
force things.
I'm going to guess you're probably going to do it in the next chapter, because the next chapter is John.
And as our listeners know, I never force a Faustus reference. Because
You've never
we've done
once done that.
4 or 5 chapters now, and it has not.
There's not been a single Faust. That's true.
Nope.
This story is not very Faustian, I don't think. It's too grounded.
Well, now that you say that, I have to look for one.
Oh,
but
okay. All right. Well, if you think this is a Faustus story, send us an email at secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. No, but really do send us your thoughts and ideas and responses to our weird theories and observations and breakdowns. We want to hear what you think. If you're on YouTube, just comment below. Also, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. Helps us a bunch. We crossed a big goal at the end of 2023. We got 500 subscribers, and we're so thrilled. So thank you all so much. If you are subscribed, if you're not, you still can become one. So please do. Otherwise, if you're listening on a podcast, you can either send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com, or send us a DM on Instagram, secondbreakfastpod. Or if you're on Patreon and you're our favorites, you can just comment on the Patreon post right there in your feed. You can also become a patron if you like for $2 a month. You get one bonus episode every month, plus access to the back catalog of bonus content we've been putting out for the last year and a half or so. the last few months we've been doing what we're calling breakfast buffets, where we do sort of a roundup of a lot of the works of art we've been consuming, whether that's TV, movies, books, music, games, albums, that like we don't have enough to say to like fill a full episode about them, but we still want to talk about them, so we kind of talk about them all like one after the other. It's been really, really fun. So check that out. But we have lots of other stuff on there too. Also, it just supports the show, so that's pretty cool. I think that's all. Because
we had to reschedule a little bit because of my mouth. So next Tuesday is going to be the 2023 Brekkie Awards.
That's right. They're supposed to be this week, but we didn't have time. We weren't able to record because of, Is
that the third or fourth year we're doing that?
The fourth.
That's pretty amazing.
Because we started doing it in 2020.
So we're going to do a year in review for 2023, and then we've got a bunch of fun award categories just reflecting on all the amazing art that we found that released this year and art that we discovered this year.
Yes, we're really excited.
That should be fun.
That'll come out on January 2nd. So right as 2024 begins.
Right.
So it'll be a nice fun...
Next Tuesday?
Next Tuesday.
Yeah, and then next Friday, of course, we'll be going into what Maggie's calling the third John chapter, John chapter 1.
Which is also a Tyrion chapter. So can't wait to get into that. I remember and love this chapter. I'm really excited to talk about it.
All right, have a good weekend, and we will see you back here for the Brekkies. Thank you again for everyone who reached out. I am feeling a bit better.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Woo.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
What a fun year for us.
It has
2023 was pretty amazing.
It was. Yeah. It was pretty good. All right. See you all in the new year.
Bye.
Bye.